Welcome to Pimpy's Investment Chat, where we keep investment talk simple. And here's your host, Pimpy.
What is going on out there, peeps? All right, I was going to do a Zim video. Well, I still am, Zim dollar video. I want to speak about the gold-backed digital currency that they have, but there's a lot of information on that. And there's a lot of information on what I'm about to go over. So the video would have just been too long. So I'm going to break it up in two pieces. So I'm going to start with what's going on in Zimbabwe over the last couple of months. The funny thing is, some of you guys might not be aware of this. The last time I think I did a video on the Zim dollar, we heard that they were starting to do good. They were moving in the right direction after they had damn near crashed. So if I look at the recent information on Zimbabwe since July, they went from the worst currency in the world to the best. Oh yeah, let's get into this. Before we get started, do me a favor and hit the thumbs up button. And if you're not a subscriber, please do so, because when you do, it helps out the channel, and I certainly do appreciate it. You can follow me over on other platforms. I do have my own group over on Facebook called Pimpy's Investment Chat. Over here, we do talk about gold, silver, cryptocurrencies, as well as foreign currency investments. So head on over here and join us. It's free to do so. In here, I do post updates. If I should get on suspension from YouTube or get removed from YouTube and you want to know what happened to me, I'll let you know right here in this group. I can be found on Twitter, MeWe, YouTube, and the cool thing about YouTube, if you come over here and you join and you find my channel, I got videos going back, I believe, a couple years. So if you want to see some older videos that I have on Nasera, Jacera, gold, silver, cryptos, come on over here and join. Look me up and check out my videos. You can also find me on Odyssey. Catch me on Rumble. When I say that the links for all these are down below in the description, some of you don't know what I'm talking about. It's real simple. Just go down to the bottom right here of any of my videos. See this? This is the description. Hit show more. And there are all the links to all the platforms I just spoke about. So even though this article is a little bit older, I do want to use it to make a point. There's a lot of people out there wanting the Iraqi dinar to be free floating. But you have to be careful when your currency is free floating. In my opinion, it should be a managed float or what's called a dirty float. That's a currency that is allowed to free float, but the government still has the right to intervene if it starts to get out of control one way or the other. So Zimbabwe stopped short of free floating currency and exchange rate battle. Zimbabwe stopped short of free floating its currency in the battle to end weeks of exchange rate volatility that has fueled the country's latest economic turmoil. The Zimbabwe dollars crashed on both the official and parallel markets. That's how bad things are when your currency crashes on both the official and parallel markets. Has triggered a six-fold rise in stocks, a surge in prices that saw monthly inflation hit double digits last month, a spike in food prices, and the currency posted a 30% weekly plunge. The local currency slumped almost 60% last month alone. Still, the central bank's monetary policy committee said the exchange rates will be market determined or free floating, falling short of calls made by the International Monetary Fund that urged authorities to remove restrictions on the exchange rate. So this is the IMF asking Zimbabwe to let their currency free float, which I think is really interesting. Because first of all, they have a restriction on their currency, and Zimbabwe's currency isn't even recognized as a currency. They're not even trading on the Forex. Under the new rules announced Tuesday, the central bank will sell foreign exchange to local banks to onward sales to their clients in an attempt to establish interbank markets. So just like over there in Iraq, they have weekly currency auctions. The easing of the dollar curve will enable the interbank Forex market to become the primary source of foreign exchange in the economy, this central bank said. So this would be one of the fears if you allow your currency to free float. If you don't have anything to offer investors out there, like what is Zimbabwe going to do in return for a stronger currency? Where's their outside investors? Is the corruption ended over there? At least over in Iraq, they have the ability, in my opinion, to do a controlled free float. Zimbabwe has nothing they can offer at the moment. Their economy is in shambles. They're unstable over there. I will show you something here in a moment of what a lot of these countries in Africa are doing. It's very interesting. So a lot of times there are people, why doesn't Iraqi dinar free float? Because it could be very, very risky. They could benefit from it. They might go in the right direction. People might think that they have something to offer, that they're worth investing into, that they have a bright, strong future in front of them, which I think Iraq does. And I think they could benefit from being on the Forex. But they have to have the restrictions removed off their currency. But in Zimbabwe's case, and no, it's not the Forex, the big Forex that Zimbabwe is on. It's a local one. Just like the Iraqi dinar is on a local one. They're not on the big Forex. Zimbabwe is taking some great strides to turn things around. Zimbabwe holds key interest rates after currency's world-beating streak. Zimbabwe's central bank held its benchmark interest rate after a sharp rebound in its currency led to monthly deflation for the first time since February. The Monetary Policy Committee maintained the world's highest interest rate of 150%. That's in their banks. But what you're looking for is higher yields. You know, how much money you're going to get back. So if you take out inflation and everything else, I think it's like 23 is what you would get if you invest your money over there, which is still a phenomenal return. In view of the current positive inflation and exchange rate developments, the MPC resolved to stay the course of the current tight monetary policy stance. Monthly consumer prices, which the central bank targets at 1 to 3%. Sound familiar? They're trying to get everybody to do that everywhere. This year fell to 15.3% in July, compared with 75% a month earlier. So this is awesome. They went from 75% on their CPI down to 15.3%. That's a huge drop. On the back of the surge in the Zimbabwe dollar, annual inflation slowed from 176% down to 101. That's really kicking ass. The MPC expected month-on-month inflation to continue to decline in the outlook period to December. Let's hope that does continue. And I hope you guys got the right Zim dollars. I keep telling you, most of you have the wrong ones. But then you have these other YouTubers going, Pimpy, you don't know what he's talking about. Nope, go ahead. You can go ahead and research yourself. All you have to do is type in which Zimbabwe dollars are currently being used in Zimbabwe. The other ones are obsolete. The local unit has strengthened about 45% against the US dollar in July. That is a huge jump. It strengthened 45% against the US dollar, making it the world's best performing currency after plunging about 85% the prior 2 months. So it went from worst to first. The liberalization of the exchange rate and a government order requiring all corporate taxes to be paid strictly in local currencies has helped spur the local dollar's recovery. This is what I'm talking about. See, Zimbabwe is trying to get away from dual currencies. They're trying to de-dollarize. Once Iraq makes that step, and I know a lot of you going, oh, they already did. No, not 100%. They need to be really strict about this. No U.S. dollars allowed for any use outside of other nations using the greenbacks to purchase oil. The economic fundamentals are strong to sustain the current stability, as reflected by the robust economic growth of 5.3% expected in 2023. A favorable balance of payments position and physical sustainability, the governor said. The strong economic fundamentals, coupled with stability in prices, will be critical in preserving the value of the domestic currency and enhancing confidence in the economy. So I told you guys I don't hold Zim dollars. But if they maintain this, then I will be holding Zim dollars. The expected continued decline in inflation and the currency appreciation are likely to be used in electioneering by incumbent president who will compete for a second term against about 10 other candidacies. So looking good for Zimbabwe, but there's something else going on. For all you Nasera Jacera people, here you go.
African nations have been made to struggle in debt traps ensured by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Since African nations were plundered and are being looted to this day, it gets hard for them to continue without having debts. That's what the West-led IMF wants. The more debt African countries will take, the more they have to follow the terms given by the West. Not only that, but it ensures that African countries never thrive and always struggle in debt traps.
See, that's what the IMF and the World Bank do. I remember about a year and a half ago, I kept saying that Iraq needs to avoid doing anything with the World Bank or the IMF, and I had people giving me crap about it, going, no, man, they need to do that. I was like, no, 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 no. These people are not your friends. Listen to what this guy's saying. They set countries up purposely to fail. And then you fall under the control of the IMF and the World Banks, and they control your monetary policy. And what do? They make you lower your inflation and deny you the ability to increase the exchange rate, to make it stronger. That's what they do. They keep your currency low so other countries can go in there, or other companies can go in there and reap the rewards of a cheaper labor force.
However, Malawi's president, Lazarus Chakwera, has demanded that the IMF should cancel its debts. It will no longer pay the debts due to its high interest rates, and the fact that they have been already paid if all payments are added. Standing at the United Nations General Assembly, he gave an ultimatum to the Western countries because he knew how they were using the IMF. He said either the debts should be canceled or it will lead Malawi to a point that the West won't like. What does he mean by that, and what is he planning to do? Let's find that out and know the whole story. President of Malawi, Lazarus Chakwera, has called upon developed nations and international financial institutions to seriously consider canceling the debts owed by struggling economies. It's enough is enough because despite struggling and leaving their population in poverty, these countries paid their debts. It's like allowing the major financiers of the IMF to make money by depriving the Africans of their basic necessities like food, clean water, and homes. Chakwera said that the significant burden faced by many least developed countries, including Malawi, works as a stumbling stone as they grapple with the perpetual challenge of repaying their debts. This burden has not only hampered their economic progress, but has also hindered their ability to bridge the gap with more economically advanced nations. Instead of helping, these loans are ensuring that the developing nations never come out of debt traps. To repay the earlier loans, these nations go for more loans, initiating a never-ending debt trap, which they will never come out of. He strengthened his demand by quoting the fact that the UN aims to end poverty by 2030. However, this will be impossible if African nations are made to pay their debts. If poverty can end by making the rich countries richer, then perhaps it's a good way. However, as we know, the case is the opposite. Developed countries must decide that the solution lies in canceling debts due upon developing nations. President Chakwera firmly stated, "We urgently require concrete actions on the debt issue because, like most least developed countries, Malawi is wrestling with an unsustainable debt burden. Our plea on behalf of all LDCs remains unchanging. Cancel the debt." Chakwera also drew attention to the fact that the United Nations community has made meager advancements in economic growth in recent years, citing a range of challenges, including the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, and the conflict in Ukraine. He argued that these formidable challenges further highlight the critical necessity of easing the debt burdens of developing countries. This call for debt cancellation echoes President Chakwera's previous address to the UN General Assembly last year, when he urged advanced economies to follow China's example in forgiving some of the debts owed by African countries. President Chakwera continues his proactive engagement with leaders of international institutions in pursuit of financial support that can aid Malawi in its relentless pursuit of economic growth. At present, Malawi is grappling with debt, particularly its commitments to the International Monetary Fund, has presented substantial hurdles to the country's economic advancement. Over the years, Malawi has accrued a considerable external debt load, including loans from global entities like the IMF. These towering debt levels have forged a situation where a substantial chunk of the nation's budget is funneled into servicing these debts. Hence, servicing this debt consumes a significant portion of the government's annual budget. Consequently, funds that could have been channeled into vital sectors such as healthcare, education, infrastructure development, and poverty alleviation are diverted to meet debt obligations. This, in turn, creates restricted fiscal space to address pressing domestic needs. The necessity to assign a substantial budget share to debt servicing has resulted in diminished public expenditure on essential social services. These include healthcare, which demands investments, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, budgets for education and poverty alleviation programs have been curtailed due to these financial constraints. Malawi also faces substantial infrastructure deficits, including deficient road networks, energy provision, and telecommunications.
Does that sound familiar? Isn't that the same issue that Iraq has?
The burden of debt deprives the government's capacity to inject investments into infrastructure development, which plays a pivotal role in fostering economic growth and attracting foreign investments. Debits, which are supposed to ease economic crises, start to jeopardize countries like Malawi. Not only that, but the debt burden perpetuates Malawi's reliance on foreign aid. With a significant chunk of the budget directed towards servicing debts, the nation depends on donor assistance to bridge the financial gap for vital programs and services. Mounting debt levels amplify the risk of debt distress, where a nation's debt becomes unsustainable. In other words, it becomes impossible for a nation to pay its debt, because if it does so, its economy will crash. That's the case with Malawi now, and that's why its president has demanded that the debts should be canceled. He implicitly said that if debts are not canceled, it will lead to inevitable Malawi will not pay the debts. Instead of that to happen, and made the IMF look weak, he demanded that it be better IMF should be the one to cancel the debts. Once these debts are canceled, Malawi should ensure that it never goes back to the IMF for more loans. You should know IMF loans often come with policy conditions such as fiscal austerity measures and structural reforms. In simple words, the IMF becomes the one taking all economic decisions on behalf of the government.
Well, now, I know somebody who was telling you guys out there that this happens. Oh yeah, that's me.
An organization makes policies. Implementing these conditions can be challenging without adverse effects on citizens' well-being. Consequently, the government's maneuverability to pursue policies aligned with long-term development goals is constrained. What's more, the volatility of the US dollar can indeed complicate Malawi's efforts to repay its debt to the International Monetary Fund. It's because the IMF uses the US dollar as its currency. Hence, Malawi typically borrows from the IMF in US dollars. When the US dollar's value rises, Malawi, using its local currency, the Malawian kwacha, must allocate more funds to acquire the same amount of US dollars needed to service its debt. This exchange rate risk significantly amplifies the cost of repaying the debt in local currency terms. As the US dollar gains strength, the size of Malawi's debt, when measured in local currency, effectively expands. This happens because Malawi has to exchange more kwacha for each dollar owed, placing a heavier burden on the country's finances. Now, to service its IMF debt, Malawi's government must allocate a substantial portion of its budget. When the local currency depreciates relative to the US dollar, the government must allocate a larger share of its budget to meet these debt obligations. This can result in limited resources for vital public services and development initiatives. In turn, a depreciating local currency can lead to higher inflation rates in Malawi. As the kwacha loses value, the cost of imported goods and services rises, contributing to inflation. Inflation, in turn, can adversely affect the country's overall economic stability and fiscal health. Not only that, but a weaker local currency deteriorates the purchasing power of Malawian consumers and businesses. This can hinder economic growth and make it more challenging for the government to generate the necessary revenue to service its debt. You should know that Malawi's ability to manage its debt repayments is influenced by factors beyond its control, such as global economic conditions and US monetary policy. Changes in these external factors can exacerbate the challenges posed by fluctuations in currency exchange rates. Now you can understand how IMF loans do more harm than good. It should be clear that Malawi's president is not requesting, rather, he is demanding. That's because he is not asking for a favor. You can understand that by knowing that due to high interest rates on the loans, if all the debt payments a country paid are added, it will be more than the debt owed to the IMF. In other words, Malawi has paid its debt, but the high interest rate is making the debt linger for decades. African countries have been servicing their debts for decades, making regular payments on interest and principal amounts. These payments have often consumed a significant portion of their national budgets. That's where it becomes clear that the International Monetary Fund utilizes debt as a tool to exercise control over African nations and restrict their advancement.
Woo, man, that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly what I was talking about. The IMF and the World Bank are evil. So you see, the United States does the same thing with Iraq the IMF does with Zimbabwe. They control the government. They control their money. They control their reserves. They control their monetary policies.
It's because African countries frequently depend on external loans and financial aid, including assistance from the IMF, to fuel their economic development initiatives. These loans come with conditions and extended repayment terms, often leading African nations into a perpetual cycle of debt where a substantial portion of their budgets is allocated to servicing these financial commitments. The IMF typically imposes policy conditions on its loans, commonly known as structural adjustment programs. Under a decent name, the IMF basically makes policies which ensure that debt becomes a key element in that country's economy. If that country stops taking loans from the IMF, it would fall. That's why countries inevitably take more and more loans from the IMF and sink deeper and deeper into the quagmire.
You see, a lot of the Western nations, what they've learned in testing this on their people is they could do the same thing to nations. First, you get them into debt, a perpetual state of debt. Then you dictate the policy. And those policies will give them the impression that they're making some kind of leeway, but it also puts them in a position to where they constantly have to borrow money. So they're in this vicious cycle of borrowing and paying back, just like a lot of the citizens of the nations. We should be able to relate to this.
The conditions necessitate that borrowing countries implement specific economic policies, which may include austerity measures, trade liberalization, and the privatization of state-owned enterprises. While these policies are intended to foster economic stability, they can also result in social and economic challenges, including reduced public spending on critical services. Critics argue that the imposition of policy conditions by the IMF could be viewed as a restriction on the sovereignty and autonomy of African nations. These governments are compelled to adopt these policies to secure financial assistance, potentially limiting their capacity to pursue domestic policies that align with their long-term development objectives. These austerity measures and policy reforms advocated by the IMF can have substantial economic repercussions. Cutbacks in public spending, particularly in healthcare and education, may hinder human development indicators. Furthermore, the privatization of state-owned assets can sometimes lead to job losses and social unrest. The state companies which were earlier creating jobs can now be owned by foreign investors. That's how the West has taken control of various companies in African countries. It first creates conditions there, so they have no other option than to sell the state companies. This burden of high levels of debt and debt servicing can make it challenging for African countries to attain debt sustainability. The constant cycle of borrowing to meet debt repayments can create a never-ending cycle of indebtedness, potentially undermining economic progress and stability. You will be surprised to know how the IMF has paralyzed Africa, using the tactics of debt traps. In 2021, a staggering 21 low-income African nations found themselves either grappling with a debt crisis or getting close to it. This alarming situation contained a formidable 58% of the countries subjected to assessment. Collectively, these nations bore the onerous burden of a substantial debt load, tallying an astonishing $644.9 billion. During 2023, African countries are destined to channel $68.9 billion toward external debt service payments. This financial commitment looms large, particularly in light of the economic challenges confronting many of these nations. To provide context, the external debt held by African countries in 2021 amounted to 24.0% of their combined GDP. This statistic showcases an alarming trend, with Africa's debt load soaring to its highest point in over a decade. As a result, 21 low-income African nations find themselves grappling with bankruptcy or tilting on the road to debt distress. The acceleration of Africa's debt, as a percentage of its GDP, has been both swift and relentless since 2014.
So what happens is, once these nations get to this point, and they don't have the money to pay back, that's when a lot of these Western nations start demanding control of their resources. Do you see how this wicked cycle continues? Sri Lanka overthrew their government and demanded Nisera Jisera. They literally said that they want debt jubilee. All the citizens demanded it. You're starting to see that trickle into other nations. They all want debt jubilee. And I believe it's going to happen. So it's looking good over there in Zimbabwe. Hopefully they'll continue to soar, especially now that they have a gold-backed digital currency. I don't support that kind of stuff, but it's going to be good to help get Zimbabwe out of the hole that they're in. Anyways, you guys let me know what you think. Do you see now what I'm talking about when I say you don't want the IMF or the World Bank involved in your government's politics? You don't want to be borrowing anything from them, because then they dictate the terms and your monetary policies. Anyways, that's it for now. Look forward to hearing from you, and I will catch you later. I am out.